They knew death was coming. They just didn't realize it would arrive dressed in a simple wooden cross, promised by a spiritual sovereign from a distant land. Can you believe that the greatest, most devastating conflict of the entire medieval era, a war that would shatter empires, bankrupt kingdoms, and drown the Holy Land in so much blood it looked like a wine press, started with a single, perfectly delivered speech?
It sounds like a myth, a dark fairy tale whispered around flickering hearth fires, but I swear to you, this is the cold, terrifying truth. This is the story of the Crusades, the unholy war that forged and nearly broke the English crown. And trust me, you are not ready for the sheer scale of the catastrophe no one saw coming. Picture the year 1095. Europe is a brutal, muddy place. Kings are fighting local squabbles, peasants are starving, and the whole continent feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for the plague or the end of days. But across the sea, something far more sinister was unfolding. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome's ancient glory, was sending desperate messages westward. They were being choked out by the rising tide of the Seljuk Turks, and if Constantinople fell, the entire Christian world was next. This was the geopolitical powder keg ready to ignite, and Pope Urban II, he was the man holding the match. He traveled to Clermont, France, and delivered the sermon that changed history forever. He didn't just ask for help, he demanded it, twisting fear and piety into a weapon more powerful than any steel sword. He painted a picture of suffering so vivid, so horrific, of innocent pilgrims being tortured, of holy sites desecrated, of the very stone where Christ walked being trod upon by the infidel, that the crowd went absolutely feral. He promised heaven itself, a full and total cancellation of every sin, past, present, and future, to anyone who would take up the cross and march east. He weaponized salvation in a way the world had never conceived. Deus vult, God wills it. The chant went up like a monstrous roar, echoing through the forests and fields, sweeping away sanity, sweeping away harvest schedules, sweeping away logic. And the immediate response, it wasn't the measured, tactical deployment of professional armies that the Pope probably expected or even wanted. No, it was an uncontrolled, volcanic explosion of fanaticism and desperation that started on the lowest rungs of society. The poor, the landless, the criminal, the deeply pious, the deeply delusional, they all heard the call. They abandoned their farms, their families, their oaths, and started stitching rough cloth crosses onto their ragged tunics. This wasn't King William Rufus of England gathering his elite knights yet. This was the terrifying spontaneous eruption known as the People's Crusade, led by a strange, charismatic mystic named Peter the Hermit. Can you imagine the horror? Tens of thousands of untrained, unequipped peasants marching across Europe, convinced God would provide food, water, and miraculous victory. They carried pitchforks instead of pikes. They mistook every large city they encountered for Jerusalem. They believed that if their faith was strong enough, walls would crumble and armies would flee. And when they inevitably ran out of supplies, they didn't pray harder, they turned savage. The journey across the Rhine became a bloodbath against the local Jewish communities, a truly staggering act of premeditated mass murder, driven by greed and religious delirium. They were told to kill the enemies of Christ, and they reasoned that the enemies of Christ were conveniently located right there in Cologne and Mainz, possessing gold and silver needed to fund their holy pilgrimage. This was the first hideous foreshadowing of what this holy war would truly look like. Less a noble defense and more a desperate apocalyptic quest that cannibalized itself before it even reached the battlefield. The sheer lack of discipline and the intensity of their religious fervor made them a walking disaster zone for everyone in their path. This disorganized rabble finally staggered into the sophisticated Byzantine territory, shocking the Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who had requested armored cavalry, not a horde of starving, violent zealots who robbed his own markets. Alexios immediately recognized them as a threat to his own capital, Constantinople, not a solution to the Turkish problem. He panicked. He packed them across the Bosphorus as fast as humanly possible, paying them to simply leave his sight, shoving them directly into the path of the highly organized, battle-hardened Seljuk army, almost guaranteeing their annihilation. It was a brutal, necessary disposal of a problem too dangerous to keep close. In the deserts of Anatolia, the vast majority of the People's Crusade was utterly slaughtered, their bones left to bleach in the sun, a horrific testament to the raw, untamed power of the Pope's words. The sheer scale of the carnage was a warning sign written in blood, yet the West simply chose to ignore it. But while the peasant army was being destroyed in the East, the real military titans, the great French, Norman, and eventually English barons, were finally mobilizing. They were slower, wealthier, and infinitely more dangerous. They saw not just salvation, but land, glory, and unimaginable riches in the sun-baked dust of the Orient. This was the moment the world pivoted, turning from regional feudalism toward global conflict. And in the shadowy, calculating corners of England's royal court, the English monarchs were beginning to measure just how much blood money and how many lives it would cost them to buy their way into eternal glory and claim a piece of that holy land. Get ready, because the gates of hell are about to swing wide open. This is only the beginning. The moment Pope Urban II finished speaking, that chilling, earth-shaking declaration of Deus Vult, the world didn't just change, it exploded. It was a spiritual supernova, radiating outward from Clermont, carrying a promise of paradise so intoxicating that rational thought simply dissolved. The sheer, unadulterated madness took hold instantly, seizing the hearts of the peasantry, the destitute, the petty thieves, and the zealots who had nothing left to lose but their souls, and everything to gain by killing in God's name. Forget the knights, forget the kings. The first wave was a tsunami of desperation, a rabid, chaotic mob known to history as the People's Crusade, and they were led by a figure straight out of a prophetic nightmare. Enter Peter the Hermit. He was not a general. He was an apparition. Lean, gaunt, riding a donkey, his dirty clothes hanging off his skeletal frame, this man wielded spiritual authority like a poisoned blade. His eyes burned with such feverish conviction that when he preached the crusade, people wept, tore their hair out, and immediately pinned the cross onto their ragged tunics. He preached not just war, but instant, guaranteed salvation. He told them the path to Jerusalem was short, protected by divine providence, and that God Himself would feed them along the way. It was the perfect lie for a starving generation, convincing them that farming tools were swords and worn shoes were sufficient for a 1,000-mile trek into a hostile desert. The speed of their mobilization was terrifying. By spring of 1096, before any major nobleman had even sharpened a lance, tens of thousands of common folk, men, women, children, and the utterly unprepared, were streaming across Europe. They believed the journey to the Holy Land was merely a long walk, perhaps a month or two. They had no logistics, no supplies, no understanding of military discipline, and absolutely no money. They were a migrating city of chaos, swelling with every village they passed, their numbers bloating to perhaps 60,000 desperate souls. The established world watched in horror as this human flood descended upon the Rhine Valley. This is where the tale of salvation quickly became the tale of atrocity. Remember, these weren't trained soldiers fighting a foreign enemy. They were religious fanatics who decided their holy war began now against the closest infidels, the Jewish communities of the Rhineland. Cities like Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne became slaughterhouses. The Crusaders, led by brutal figures like Count Emico, rationalized. Why travel thousands of miles to kill Christ's enemies when they were right here? The logic was monstrously simple. Plunder the wealth of the Jews to fund the journey to Jerusalem, and cleanse the local territory of unbelievers simultaneously. It was a shocking betrayal of Christian doctrine, but in the heat of holy zeal, no sin seemed too great. Synagogues were burned, entire populations were corralled, and given the impossible choice, convert or die. Thousands chose martyrdom, their screams echoing through the medieval streets. This wasn't warfare. It was pure, targeted pogrom, an explosion of greed and religious hatred that stained the very beginning of the Crusades crimson. The local bishops tried, weakly, to protect the Jewish citizens, but the mob was uncontrollable. fueled by apocalyptic fervor and the intoxicating scent of easy blood and stolen gold. The sheer scale of the massacre was unprecedented in Western Europe. But the true reckoning was yet to come, because while they had mastered killing the defenseless, they were about to meet an enemy who fought back. As this ill-disciplined horde staggered through Hungary and into the Byzantine Empire, the Emperor Alexios I Komnenos watched from Constantinople with dread. He had asked for mercenary help, not a horde of starving, violent vagrants. He quickly realized this army was a threat to his own capital. The journey was horrific. Starvation turned them into thieves. They looted Christian towns and battled Hungarian forces just to secure bread. They were already dying of disease and hunger long before they saw an actual Muslim foe. When they finally reached Constantinople, Alexios rushed to ferry them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia, desperate to get them out of his civilized territory and into enemy lands. He knew what would happen next. Peter the Hermit, having lost all control over his followers, could only watch as the People's Crusade fractured into smaller, rapacious groups. Ignoring the desperate warnings of Byzantine scouts, the main force, led by men even more reckless than Peter, stormed out of Constantinople's protection and into the Sultanate of Rum. They were looking for a fight, and they found oblivion. They camped near Civitate, believing themselves safe, still bloated with the arrogance of their initial, easy victories against unarmed civilians in Europe. But Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, was not a bishop hiding behind city walls. Kilij Arslan was a seasoned warrior, and he saw not an army, but a shambles. He allowed them to press forward, lulling them into a false sense of security before launching a catastrophic ambush. On October 21, 1096, the Turkish forces descended like a whirlwind. The battlefield was not a strategic engagement. It was a massacre. The poorly armed crusaders broke instantly, their religious zeal dissolving into panic. Thousands were cut down, their bodies littering the plain. Women and children were captured and enslaved. The entire fighting force of the People's Crusade was annihilated in a single afternoon. Peter the Hermit, having conveniently been back in Constantinople pleading for supplies when the slaughter occurred, was one of the few survivors. The rest of his misguided followers had paid the ultimate price for believing a fairy tale. This amateur, bloody catastrophe, the People's Crusade, was the opening act, a chilling, terrifying prelude that proved just how brutal this religious war would become. It was the warning sign that the real work required not just faith, but steel, strategy, and the iron will of Europe's most powerful warlords. The stage was now clear for the heavyweights, the mighty princes and the future English monarchs to step into the blood-soaked arena. The warm-up was over. The main event was about to begin.
The stench of failure, the rotting corpses of the misguided People's Crusade, still hung heavy in the air over Anatolia. It was a terrifying, bloody warning, yet somehow it only amplified the zeal of the true army preparing to march. The curtain had fallen on Peter the Hermit's disastrous amateur hour, and now the heavy, iron-shod boots of the professional warriors began to shake the very foundations of the continent. This was not a rabble driven by starvation and manic prophecy. This was the hammer of God, meticulously forged in the workshops of Europe's most ambitious and ruthless warlords. Every duke, count, and prince who mattered was strapping on his shield, mortgaging his ancestral lands, and pledging his life to the holiest, most impossible mission ever conceived. They weren't seeking simple redemption. They were hunting for eternal glory, earthly kingdoms, and the absolute destruction of the infidel. The sheer scale of the mobilization was an economic catastrophe and a military miracle rolled into one. From the dense, cold forests of Lotharingia came Godfrey of Bouillon, a towering figure marked by a ferocious piety, leading the armies of northern France and Germany. Godfrey was not just a warrior, he was an ascetic, a man rumored to have sworn never to wear a crown in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns, a promise that hinted at the incredible, almost suicidal, purity of his mission. Then there was Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, the oldest and perhaps the wealthiest of the Crusaders, a grizzled veteran who sold everything he owned, taking a solemn, irrevocable oath never to return home. He marched with Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the official papal legate, giving his massive Provençal contingent an undeniable spiritual authority that none of the other leaders could match. Raymond sought not just the Holy Sepulchre, but the unquestioned spiritual supremacy of the entire enterprise. But the most dangerous, the most calculating, and arguably the most brilliant of them all, arrived from the Norman lands of southern Italy, Bohemond of Taranto, a man whose cunning was sharper than any blade. Bohemond saw the crusade not as a pilgrimage, but as the greatest land grab in history. He was a second son, hungry for a kingdom, and his gaze was fixed not just on Jerusalem, but on the rich Byzantine territories he was supposed to be protecting. These separate armies, fractured by language, ambition, and loyalty, but united by the terrifying power of the cross, began their monumental, staggering journey across the vast, hostile landscape of Europe. We are talking about perhaps 60,000 to 100,000 people in total. Not just knights, but squires, servants, priests, engineers, and camp followers. It was a moving city of iron and faith, requiring mountains of supplies that simply did not exist along their routes. The logistics were a nightmare made real. Rivers had to be bridged under constant threat of famine. Locals, terrified of the massive, hungry host,
were often looted without mercy. The path of the prince's crusade was paved not with gold, but with forced requisitions, diplomatic flare-ups, and the increasingly desperate need to simply keep moving forward before the entire enterprise collapsed under its own weight. The destination of this iron tide was Constantinople, the glorious golden seat of the Byzantine Empire, ruled by the shrewd and increasingly anxious Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. Alexios had asked for mercenary help, for a few thousand heavy cavalry to shore up his borders. What he got was the entire explosive population of Western Europe arriving on his doorstep, demanding passage and expecting royal treatment. When these Western titans arrived at the glittering walls of Constantinople, the tension was palpable enough to crack marble. Alexios saw the Crusaders not as saviors, but as dangerously uncivilized rivals, loud, demanding, and utterly unwilling to bend the knee to Byzantine protocol. He knew that if he allowed this monstrous army to pass through Asia Minor without extracting solemn oaths of loyalty, they would simply carve out new kingdoms from his reclaimed territory. The ensuing political showdowns were a masterclass in high-stakes medieval diplomacy, full of mistrust and barely concealed threats. Alexios, holding the keys to the supply routes and the crucial intelligence, demanded that every major leader swear an oath of fealty, promising to return any formerly Byzantine lands they managed to capture. One by one, under immense pressure, the great leaders submitted. Godfrey, the pious warrior, knelt. Raymond, the spiritual leader, grudgingly complied. But Bohemond of Taranto, the sly fox who knew exactly what he wanted, saw this oath as a mere inconvenience. He performed the ritual with cold calculation, already planning the moment he would break his word and claim his own prize. The winter of 1096-1097 was spent in this simmering cauldron of suspicion and preparation. Alexios wanted them gone. The Crusaders desperately needed his supplies and maps. Finally, in the spring, the great host was ferried across the Bosphorus, leaving the safety of Europe behind. They landed in Asia Minor, an arid, hostile wilderness, still haunted by the specters of the previous failed crusade. They were now deep in Seljuk territory, the lands of the terrifying Sultan Kilij Arslan I, the man who had effortlessly obliterated Peter the Hermit's army. The games were over. The princes were about to face a hardened, professional enemy, who fought not for salvation, but for survival, and who knew every twisting valley and scorching desert pass. The road to Jerusalem was now open, and it was guaranteed to be stained with the blood of kings. The desert had swallowed Peter the Hermit's ragged horde whole, their bones bleaching under the Anatolian sun, serving as a terrifying monument to zealotry without structure. But this catastrophic failure, this horrifying annihilation, did not extinguish the fire. It merely refined the steel. The true storm was gathering. This was not a spontaneous pilgrimage driven by desperation. This was the methodical, calculated mobilization of the elite military apparatus
of Western Europe. The great princes, the dukes, and the counts, men who inherited ancient Roman steel and Norman ferocity, were now strapping the blood-red cross upon their armor. They did not march under a single banner, for their egos were too immense and their rivalries too deep to accept a singular master. This was a coalition of kings in all but name, financed by debt, driven by the whispered promise of eternal paradise, and fueled by the horrifying spectacle of the people's crusade failure. The year 1096 saw the feudal structure of the West temporarily collapse under the weight of this religious fever and logistical nightmare. Who were these titans preparing to shatter the borders of the known world? First, the reluctant commander, the pious and formidable Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine. A man of quiet strength, he was so determined to participate that he mortgaged his entire estate, sacrificing earthly security for spiritual gain. He was the spiritual anchor of the massive endeavor. Then came the flamboyant and almost terrifyingly ambitious Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman prince of southern Italy. Bohemond was not driven by piety. He was driven by land, by power, and by the sheer, exhilarating thrill of conquest. His cunning was legendary, his forces ruthless, and his ultimate goal was not Jerusalem's freedom, but its annexation under his own banner. And bringing the savage fighting legacy of the Normans, though not the crowned King of England himself, was Robert Curthose, the eldest son of William the Conqueror and Duke of Normandy. Robert was known for his reckless bravery, his generous spirit, and his perpetual inability to manage his own treasury. To finance his part in this grand apocalyptic adventure, Robert made the devil's bargain with his younger brother, the cold, calculating, and efficient King William II Rufus of England. For a staggering sum of 10,000 marks of silver, enough to fund an army for years, Robert mortgaged the entire Duchy of Normandy to his brother. This single transaction was not just a fundraising effort, it was a political earthquake. It placed the rich, strategic lands of Normandy directly under the control of the English crown, fundamentally destabilizing the political balance of the fractured Norman Empire, and setting the stage for decades of fratricidal war upon Robert's inevitable, desperate return. Finally, the oldest and wealthiest of the company, Raymond IV of Toulouse, Count of Provence. He viewed himself as the true leader, the only one fit to claim the crown of the Holy City. His pride was immense, his commitment absolute, and he was the only prince who did not swear an oath of fealty to the Byzantine emperor without extreme duress and negotiation. These separate, colossal armies, numbering perhaps 60,000 fighting men and countless non-combatants, a moving city of steel, hunger, and devotion, did not march together. They moved like slow-motion plagues across the European landscape, demanding food, leaving ruin, and terrifying the very Byzantine allies
they were supposedly rushing to defend.
When the first of the princes finally reached the impossible golden walls of Constantinople, the Emperor Alexeios I Komnenos looked out from his battlements and saw not saviors, but vultures descending on his empire. He was paralyzed by fear.
Alexios knew these Westerners, wild, brutal, driven by a faith he barely understood, and far more interested in carving out new kingdoms than restoring old ones. He had to neutralize them before they turned their swords against his own magnificent city, the last true remnant of Roman glory. The emperor's strategy was pure, desperate maneuver. He demanded that every single prince swear an oath of fealty, promising to return any conquered former Byzantine territory back to the empire. This was a direct challenge to their greed, a trap laid with paper and ink.
The atmosphere in Constantinople became toxic. Bohemond, the cunning Norman, was the first to acquiesce, calculating that an oath was merely words, and that the reward was worth the lie. Godfrey and Robert Curthose followed. But Raymond of Toulouse refused outright, his aristocratic pride forbidding him from bowing to a foreign emperor. The standout was tense, threatening to turn the entire crusade into a war between Christendom's East and West before the true enemy was even encountered. Eventually, through threats and lavish gifts, Raymond offered a carefully worded compromise, not an oath of fealty, but a promise not to harm the emperor. With this fragile arrangement secured, Alexios, desperate to see these ravenous armies leave his capital, began to ferry them across the Bosphorus. The moment their boots touched the soil of Asia Minor, the crucible truly began. They had left the relative safety of the West and entered the scorched, unforgiving lands held by the Seljuk Turks, enemies who understood the terrain and fought not for relics, but for the very ground beneath their feet. The first objective was Nicaea, a heavily fortified city and the Seljuk Sultan's capital. The massive force of the Prince's Crusade laid siege, a sprawling, chaotic encirclement of starvation, disease, and relentless battle. The Crusaders were finally fighting the Holy War, but they were doing so under the watchful, nervous eyes of the Byzantines. Their sheer numbers began to tell, but their disorganization almost cost them everything. The siege dragged on, and just as the final, brutal assault was planned, Alexios struck his final, devastating maneuver. He secretly negotiated the surrender of Nicaea directly with the Turks, ensuring the city and its vast treasury were handed over to Byzantine forces, not the Crusaders. The princes watched in stunned, enraged silence as the Byzantine flag was hoisted above the walls, their prize snatched away just as victory was achieved. The betrayal was absolute, the rift between the East and West cemented by this act of calculated self-preservation. The Crusaders had secured their first major victory, but they had also learned the first brutal lesson of the East. Trust no one, especially not your allies. The road to Jerusalem was now paved with vengeance, betrayal,
and the knowledge that the true war was fought on two fronts.
The echoes of the massacred rabble at Civitot were still screaming in the winds that swept across the smoking plains of Anatolia. Peter the Hermit's pathetic, failed campaign was nothing but a cautionary tale, a lesson in humility written in the blood of 10,000 desperate souls. But now the true reckoning was underway. The real instruments of God's perceived wrath were finally mobilizing, a force so staggering it threatened to destabilize the entire map of Europe and the Middle East. These were not the starved, ecstatic peasants of the first wave. These were the titans of Western Europe, the high nobility who held the keys to kingdoms, men who treated warfare not as a pilgrimage, but as an extremely high-stakes, ruthless business venture. Their motivation was a lethal cocktail of absolute religious fervor, the pursuit of immense terrestrial glory, and the promise of land and power far removed from the petty squabbles of Europe. The sheer logistics of this movement were apocalyptic. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands, stretching for miles, a river of steel and faith flowing toward the golden city of Constantinople, devouring every resource in their path, leaving famine and panic in their wake across Hungary and the Balkans. Three figures, three colossal egos, dominated this immense gathering, each viewing the others with suspicion, vying for the undisputed spiritual and military leadership of the Holy War. First, there was Raymond IV of Toulouse, Count of St. Gilles, an elderly, powerful lord, convinced of his own divine mandate, bringing with him the immense wealth of southern France and the symbolic blessing of the papacy. He saw the crusade not just as a mission, but as a path to a crown far greater than any European title, a king under God, and he viewed any rival claim with severe, icy disdain. Then came the cunning, terrifyingly ambitious Normans, led by Bohemond of Toronto, a towering figure known for his political genius and his brutal effectiveness on the battlefield. Bohemond was not interested in prayers or relics. He was interested in carving a permanent, powerful principality out of the vulnerable body of the East. He was pure predator, and he was absolutely certain that the chaos of the crusade was his golden opportunity. Finally, the deeply pious yet equally ambitious Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, arrived. Driven by a genuine, consuming faith, Godfrey was also burdened by staggering debt, having mortgaged nearly everything he owned just to equip his formidable contingent. For Godfrey, failure meant not just damnation, but total financial ruin. As these monstrous contingents, roughly 60,000 to 100,000 individuals, including support staff, converged upon the heavily fortified walls of Constantinople, Emperor Alexeios I Komnenos looked out from his salvation, but invasion. He had requested help, yes, but he had received a cataclysm. The air within the imperial court was thick with fear and paranoia. Alexios knew that if these Western barbarians were allowed to roam freely inside his magnificent city,
Constantinople would be consumed. He immediately launched a diplomatic offensive designed to contain and control the massive influx of armed lords. The emperor demanded that every single Western leader swear the most binding, terrifying oath. Every city, every fortress, every inch of land recaptured from the Turks that had once belonged to the Byzantine Empire must be immediately and unconditionally returned to imperial rule.
The tension was almost unbearable. Raymond IV, recognizing the political necessity and desiring to maintain his image as the Church's loyal instrument, took the oath. Godfrey, after immense pressure and veiled threats of supply cuts, reluctantly followed suit. But Bohemond, the Viper of Taranto, understood exactly what this oath meant. A guarantee of future conflict. He swore the oath with a smile that promised immediate future betrayal, already calculating the geopolitical moves necessary to circumvent the emperor's fragile trust and claim his own prize. The agreement, signed in mutual distrust, allowed the armies to be rapidly ferried across the treacherous Bosphorus, moving them out of the emperor's sight and directly into the heart of enemy territory, the shattered, scorched landscape of Anatolia, ruled by the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Their first true objective, the first bloody validation of their mission, was Nicaea. This was not just a city, it was the capital of Sultan Kilij Arslan I, and the site where the vast majority of the People's Crusade had been brutally butchered just months earlier. Failure here would mean total annihilation. The siege of Nicaea commenced with a fury and efficiency that stunned the Turkish defenders. The Crusaders deployed massive siege engines, built towers taller than the city walls, and endured weeks of grueling, brutal counterattacks and constant missile fire. Sultan Kilij Arslan I, having underestimated the organization and professionalism of this second wave, rushed back from campaigning in the east, confident he could crush these new arrivals just as easily as he had the last. He was grievously mistaken. The clash outside Nicaea was a devastating, total rout for the Seljuk relief forces. The concentrated charge of the Western heavy cavalry, the disciplined shield walls, and the sheer ferocity of the knights proved an unstoppable force against the lighter, faster Turkish horse archers when they were forced into close quarters. Nicaea was doomed. Starvation and the relentless pressure of the siege had broken the defenders, and the Crusaders prepared for the final bloody assault, eager for the plunder, the glory, and the symbolic victory of taking the first major city. But Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, ever the schemer, had been watching the siege unfold with growing dread. He feared that if the Crusaders took Nicaea by storm, the ensuing slaughter would make them ungovernable, and they would claim the city for their own. In a stunning act of political treachery, Alexios secretly opened negotiations with the desperate Turkish garrison inside Nicaea, using his own agents and bypassing the Crusader commanders entirely. He offered the garrison protection and guaranteed their safety if they surrendered the city
to the imperial Byzantine forces instead of the Crusaders. The following morning, the Crusader leaders woke up ready for the dawn assault, the horns sounding the final charge, only to watch in disbelief as the enormous double-headed eagle banner of Byzantium was raised high above the Nicaean ramparts. The gates were closed. The prize was snatched away. A volcanic wave of betrayal and murderous rage swept through the Crusader camps. They had bled and died for weeks, only to have their victory stolen by their supposed ally. Alexios, hiding behind the walls, attempted to placate the enraged lords with lavish gifts of gold and provisions. It was not enough. The incident solidified the deepest, most corrosive suspicion in the hearts of the Western princes. The Byzantines were not their allies. They were opportunistic, untrustworthy schemers, willing to sacrifice Western lives only to claim the spoils. The oath they had sworn to Alexios now felt like a curse, and the two-front war, against the Saracen and against the deceptive East, had just begun in earnest. The glittering city of Nicaea, the first major prize, had been snatched from their very grasp. The gates, which they had bled to break, opened not to the victorious trumpets of the Western knights, but to the slinking, silent entrance of the Byzantine legions. Alexios had played them, a master manipulator, moving pawns across the Anatolian chessboard. The promised riches, the bounty that was meant to finance the rest of their holy march, evaporated into the emperor's heavily guarded vaults. Rage was a physical thing, a crushing weight in the throats of men like Bohemond of Taranto. He had engineered the siege, tasted the victory, only to be given trinkets and empty promises, while the emperor secured a vital border city. The other leaders, Godfrey, Raymond, Robert, stood in stunned silence, their piety momentarily eclipsed by sheer political fury. They were learning the hard way. In the East, salvation came second to survival, and oaths were merely suggestions written in sand. They were betrayed, yes, but they were also trapped. To turn back was to face the wrath of the church and the shame of failure. They had to push forward, deeper into the heat-scorched, unforgiving interior of Anatolia, where every shadow held a potential assassin, and every stream was poisoned. The decision was made to abandon the coast and plunge into the central plateau, a desperate move necessitated by logistics and strategic haste. To manage the vast, sprawling mob of soldiers, pilgrims, and camp followers, now numbering perhaps 100,000 souls, a staggering, destructive tide of humanity, the army deliberately split into two massive columns. This was a calculated, terrifying risk, trading unified security for crucial speed across the vast Ottoman-controlled territory. They believed the risk was worth the prize, but the price would almost be annihilation. The advance column, marching a full day ahead and vulnerable, was commanded by the wily, suspicious Bohemond, his dashing nephew Tancred, and the dependable Robert of Normandy. They were the bait, the tip of the spear, expected to find the Saracen resistance first and test the mettle of the enemy. The second heavier column trailed far behind, comprised of the solemn Godfrey of Bouillon, the powerful Raymond of Toulouse, and the spiritual anchor, the papal legate Adhemar.
They marched separated by miles of unforgiving scrubland, unaware that Sultan Kilij Arslan, fresh from his humiliating, gold-costing defeat at Nicaea, was watching their movements like a hungry wolf tracking injured prey. The Sultan was not defeated. He was merely relocated. He had gathered the full, terrifying might of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, thousands of swift, deadly horse archers, and he knew exactly where he would strike. He intended to wipe out the Western invaders in the desolate, waterless plains near Dorialeum, a perfect ambush site where their heavy armor and lack of maneuverable cavalry would prove fatal. The morning of July 1st, 1097, broke not with the sound of trumpets, but with the sound of pure, heart-stopping chaos. Bohemon's unsuspecting camp, rousing themselves from sleep and preparing for another brutal day of marching, were immediately engulfed by a relentless storm of arrows.